But yeah, tell us a little bit about what you're doing at the moment, Divolka.
Hi everyone, my name's Divolka. I'm currently a core surgical trainee CT1 in Yorkshire and the Humber in Leeds at the minute. So my journey was that I went to med school in Leeds, absolutely loved it. Then I did F1, F2 and my F3 around Northwest London. And I've just moved back up north for surgical training and affordable rent.
As
So
we can see in the background as well.
you see my lovely...
That's an advert for the north there, right there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
love coming to their background.
I mean, so I'm from the East Midlands. I'm from Derby, so I'm always
So
repping
you know, yeah,
the north.
yeah. It's a bit grey outside, but we won't focus on the weather. Yeah, so I did a teaching fellow job for my F3, and I think it's really important what you guys are trying to do because I didn't really have many people to talk to about it. I didn't really have any very set plans, which I wish that I had had as even as like a medical student or an F1, F2, deciding kind of what you want to do for your F3 is I think quite important. So I think it's really nice that you guys are opening that platform out to everyone.
Yeah, exactly. I think I was in a very similar position to you, Divolka. So yeah, hopefully we'll be able to pick up on some questions that the attendees will have. But yeah, we're just going to go to Sargin first and let him introduce himself as well.
Hi everyone. So yeah, I'm Sargin, Clinical Leadership and Innovation Fellow at Imperial. Alongside Shiv, we've established the portfolio clinic and we're providing the F3 series, as Divolka has mentioned, and Shiv has mentioned as well. So yeah, that's just a tiny nugget about myself.
Great. So should we start and find out a little bit more about Divolka and what you've done? So you were a undergraduate surgical medical education fellow.
Yes.
And yeah, what did that involve? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so basically yeah, you're right, as an undergraduate surgical clinical teaching fellow, which is a lot of words, but basically if you're applying for a teaching fellow job, you can either be a teaching fellow with like the medical school or the college. So you would go down the route of more like assessments and feedback and doing medical student exams and things like that. I was more clinical, so I was employed by the trust to do teaching for students who were doing surgical placements in the hospital that I was based at. So mainly I was with the orthopedic team. So I was delivering musculoskeletal teaching, which was ortho, and there was also a rheumatology fellow. So we did that together. Mainly for final year medical students, but also I was kind of doing surgical skills, surgical simulation, and bits and pieces for first, second, third years. Yeah, so it was quite a nice breadth of everyone at different stages throughout medical school. It was quite a varied job in it that obviously I did my kind of routine MSK teaching, but also we got to run kind of simulations. So like your A to E assessments on like a fake patient and things like that. So whilst obviously being really educational for the students, that was really fun for us. So that's something that you can do. I had the pleasure of doing this job over COVID, which has its pros and cons, but we'll talk about that later. But I kind of got to get quite involved in coming up with new methods of teaching online, new kind of digitally assisted things that they're putting into place at medical schools now, which was really cool. And it also gave me a bit of a chance to do some portfolio building. I did a PG cert in university education. I kind of did audits and research and stuff like that. So overall, I had a really good time. So that was in a nutshell kind of what I spent my year doing.
That is a lot of
Very impressive, yeah. A lot of stuff for the portfolio as well, as you've mentioned. And anybody who knows us knows that we absolutely adore portfolio work and portfolios. That's what we're all about. So that ticks the boxes in our eyes.
It sounds like you've accomplished a lot in just 12 months, effectively. And I think we'll come on to talk about some of those things, like how you can get involved with the PG certs through your med-ed fellows. I think one important thing is I think from my perspective, as an FT, I think it seemed like quite a daunting prospect of sort of bridging or sort of leaving clinical practice for a year to go into just med-ed. So how did you feel about that jump? Did you know you definitely wanted to do it, or was it just an opportunity that came up?
Yeah, it was difficult because at the time that we were applying for these jobs or thinking about doing them when I was in F2, the pandemic hadn't really hit yet. So all of my friends were going to do F3s. It was just a given. It wasn't that we were desperate to take time out of clinical practice or anything like that. It was just that we were like, oh, well, maybe we'll go to Australia, or maybe we'll travel for a bit, and maybe so none of us applied for training jobs. And then the pandemic kind of hit, and a few people were still like, we'll go to Australia and we'll travel. But the reality of that for me was very much like, do I go to Australia, perhaps not be able to come home, perhaps not be able to travel around Australia? That would be a bit devastating, or New Zealand or wherever. So then I was kind of looking at my other options. And you can always take a junior clinical fellow or JCF role in a clinical specialty. For me, I've always really enjoyed teaching. I've always been involved in it as a medical student, F1, F2, but you never really get the chance to provide coherent teaching or consistent teaching. And so when I heard about the opportunity of doing it, and if you have a look on NHS jobs or whatever, there'll be plenty of options for either teaching fellow or education fellow or just clinical trust grade jobs. I knew I wanted to do surgery, so I wanted something that incorporated that. And yeah, I just kind of found the job advert, looked at the specification, figured that was something that I would enjoy, and went for it, really. But really, yes, it is daunting, as you're saying, to answer your question. You don't think about it when you go into the job, but as you're coming to the end of the year, you realize, oh, I haven't actually spoken to a patient in a really long time. And that depends on what your kind of clinical involvement is with patients. But for me, I got to organize my own clinical time in theatre, basically. So I went and I did a bit of kind of helping consent, but mainly my patients were asleep by the time I got there. So going back into that and starting again as a surgical trainee, you do think, oh, should have picked up a couple of locums, but it comes back to you really quickly. It really does. It's nothing to be worried about. If you've passed F2 and you've done your ARCP, then there's no reason you can't drop in and out as you need to. So I wouldn't let that put you off taking a non-clinical role. And you can always pick up a locum here or there, or take some time to just go back into the hospital and reacquaint yourself.
Yeah.
It sounds like it was a very sort of flexible program in that sense, which is something that non-training grade doctors and F3s really crave and cry for. And I think it's quite interesting from when we see the contrast in terms of Samir last week. Obviously, he had worked in the same hospital. Everything was a lot more internal. It sounds like your process was a lot more sort of uncertain in terms of where you wanted to go, what you wanted to do. And it was an external process that you know, in terms of looking at the job criteria and applying, which we'd love to hear about. It's just really interesting to see that sort of contrast, but in sort of not really similar roles, but similar areas, I guess, and similar stages in your training or in your career.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of people, and I didn't necessarily want to stick. I wanted to stay in London, but I didn't intend on staying in the same trust or staying in the same place. I think it's very good to get out and stretch your wings and see different trusts and hospitals and things like that. It just so happened that I applied and this interview went well and I got that job. But it is something that I do encourage people to think about. I had a lot of medical students who I was teaching saying, you know, I want to stay in this specific part of the world. I don't ever want to move. And I think that's a bit of a shame. I think you really should go and experience, whether you're moving to the north or the south, wherever, seeing a bit of a different aspect of life. But in terms of the application process, for people who are interested, obviously everything for me anyway was online. So it was all, you look at the specification of several different jobs, you have a like a personal statement kind of thing, you put all your CV bits and bobs down. The one thing that nobody told me is kind of like Oriel, when you're an F1, F2 applying for specialty jobs, you have to do the application for every different job that you apply for. You can't just have like a template that you use, which
very a rigid way of conducting this, but I guess it's you know, we're used to it to a certain extent.
And one thing that we were told when we started was that, when I started in my teaching fellow job, was that there were actually a lot more applicants than I thought there would have been for a job like this. And I suppose in retrospect, and I urge you to do this when you're looking for jobs, is look at exactly what you're being offered. Because for me, I got half a day of clinical time a week, which was actually really flexible. You could do a day a fortnight, or if you wanted to take a week as a block, you could do that. So I definitely got guaranteed clinical time every week. I got half a day a week to do research and development, and half a day a week set aside for my PG cert. And when I was applying for jobs, not a lot of places offered all those three things. So I knew that those things I definitely wanted. And when I was applying, I made it clear on the application that those were things I intended to really take advantage of and be involved in, which they want to know. They want to know that they're not just giving you that time for you to not use it. So you do have to, I think, tailor a bit of your application to what the job opportunities are. And especially if you get an interview, for something like a teaching job, it's really easy to see people who are not interested in teaching. And whilst your portfolio is really important, it's really easy to spot in an interview who's just like, this is a CV builder for me. I'm not interested in actually consistently teaching. I'm just doing it as a means to an end. I did some of the interviews for my successors. And that was, and the consultants who are with us also know the dean of the med school.
They have the experience, don't they?
Exactly,
they know exactly from a teaching point of view, especially in medicine.
Exactly. If it's something that you are umming and eyeing about and you are okay with teaching, but you don't think you want to commit, it's probably better that you pick something else that you know that you're going to really enjoy, because it's quite a lot of that as a commitment. But that's something that when you're in an interview, if you are interviewing for this, I think your enthusiasm about the teaching that you have done, even if it's limited, what you would like to do in the future, what kind of programs you want to set up, that's what people want to hear. And kind of how the job will build you, not just as in
the long term, your long-term commitment.
Yeah, exactly. How are you going to take this forward? So those are things that I think will set you in good stead for an application.
I think I think what you've said is really important, about knowing you want to do it before you're going into it. And for the attendees that don't know, from my experience, a lot of the clinical education fellows are more 9 to 5 or 8 to 4 than clinical roles, because I mean there's no on-call unless you've got clinical component. There's no on-call part of it. But that doesn't, from my experience of knowing people, that doesn't mean there's less work. I think there's a lot of work, and there's a lot of like different work in terms of the admin and the things. So I think we'll come on to that. There's a couple of questions we have from the attendees. So just mostly about the application process, Divolka. So it's about when these jobs are advertised, and also like how to find out about them. So whether it's an oral and NHS jobs. So you answer that.
Yeah, so mostly on NHS jobs. If there is a specific, Oriel doesn't do anything as far as I'm aware for like out of training jobs. So for F3, F4 jobs, I wouldn't be looking at Oriel. I found my jobs on NHS jobs, but if you want to work in a specific hospital, they like each hospital will have, or each trust will have their own kind of recruitment page on their website. So have a look on there for jobs that are being advertised if you're very specific about where you want to work, or email somebody in their recruitment department. There's no set time that jobs are advertised. Like there's not like one date where everything comes out. Places tend to start advertising sometime around like anytime between like October, November of the prior year to I think even like May, June of the following year. So because you're out of training, you have that kind of advantage of being able to apply for jobs as and when. So start looking early. I think you can tailor a search on NHS jobs, and you can kind of add things to your favorites, and you'll get emails every day or every couple of days saying, this job has come up, this job has come up. So you can keep on top of it. You can add things to your saved jobs and things like that on NHS jobs. And you can apply to as many as you want to. You can interview for as many as you want to. It's just that once you've interviewed and confirmed a job, that I think professionally you should take it. But apart from that, it's quite a free process in terms of what you can and can't choose. So keep an eye on it. It does get refreshed quite often. And especially in London, sometimes they don't put the jobs up, or from what I've seen, trusts sometimes advertise in-house. So if you really want to work somewhere, email their recruitment department and say, if you have any F3 or trust grade teaching jobs or education jobs, please can you put me on a list to be emailed when they come out? And that's probably a good way to go about it.
Yeah,
I think that's a reoccurring theme from last week. I think if you really want some of these jobs and you're really focused on like a certain place or location, putting yourself out there and sending some emails and finding out more about what they expect, from applicants to that job. People actually are surprisingly open with that sort of information. And the other thing to mention from my experience on NHS jobs is that they normally will open a job for 2 weeks or something. But a lot of those jobs will say at the bottom of them, we have the right to close this vacancy early if we have enough applicants. So if you see a job and you really like it, get that application in early. And then the other thing, which is kind of disheartening, is some jobs that you apply to, you don't actually hear back from. So they won't ever say, oh, you've been unsuccessful. You just will not hear. So don't hang on. If you've applied for a couple, don't hang on and wait for the response. Just keep on applying to as many as you want, because that's going to maximize the chance of you getting sort of the interview and the job for something you actually want to do in your F3 year.
I absolutely second that. And please don't feel bad about emailing people repeatedly if they've not emailed you back with the status of your job application, because sometimes they've just missed a letter out of your email address or like something stupid like that. So I emailed places several times. Please also don't feel bad about emailing consultants about jobs, like especially clinical jobs.
Be so persistent that they give you the job.
Yeah, exactly. They can't say no. But sometimes, especially consultants and things like that, they do remember you. So I emailed a consultant and said, do you have any JCF jobs going? And she said, oh, really sorry, not at the minute. And then she emailed me back 6 months later saying, oh, actually, I remember that you emailed me. Are you still interested? So people do remember you. So bear that in mind.
Yeah, I think that's all really important information. We'll move on a little bit, maybe. I think it'd be useful to find out a little bit more about their day-to-day job, because you mentioned that you were doing some research and your PG cert. So yeah, talk us about like your average week and what that was like.
Yeah, so very dependent on the time of year, obviously, because different students start at different times. So sometimes you'll just have your final year students, sometimes you'll have final year, third year, first year, second year. And then obviously as you get to the end of the year, everybody's got exams. And then towards the very end of the year, all the students are gone, so you're pretty free. That's something to bear in mind. But to begin with, you will work with the consultant who is the lead for your module, or whatever it is that you're teaching, and you'll come up with a timetable of how many times you're supposed to be teaching the students. For example, I had final year MSK students, so I would teach them on a Monday morning, Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and then I would schedule my other stuff in around that. So if I then had third years that cropped up in October, November, I would fit their teaching around the teaching that I'd already established. So in that way, you have a degree of flexibility. You are able to take on other stuff that you want to do. So although I was a clinical fellow, I did some of the lecture-based teaching as well for the first and second years, which you do have to, your first priority is to teach your clinical students, but if you can fit other stuff in, that's fine. In terms of PG cert, you are not guaranteed a PG cert. It's just that the job comes with allowance of time for if you apply, because they're not saying you have to do one. It's strongly recommended that you do one. And some teaching fellow jobs come with an allowance, money allowance for you to do that. So I think where I worked, they would subsidize up to £2,000 or something of a PG cert, which is usually somewhere between £3,000 and £5,000. So you'd get a bit of a bursary for that. You do have to apply yourself to the PG cert, so you'll have to do some kind of, I guess, research into what modules you like, what university you want to do it at. And then obviously you take study leave days for the days that you have either face-to-face or online teaching, but I was given an extra half a day a week on top of that to do essays and that kind of stuff. So that was very flexible. I could take that whenever I had time, or whenever I needed to. So that was part of my regular week. Clinical activity wise, because I was with the orthopedic team, I worked with the consultant who was leading final year MSK, and he said, I have a list all day Thursday, so you can come whenever you like. So I would go in Thursday mornings or Thursday afternoons. So that was my half a day a week. And I just told my supervisor that that's my clinical time. It might change, but that was a fixed part. And then I got involved with a couple of med ed projects and a couple of ortho projects, and I just fit that in as and when. So it is flexible day to day. It can get quite busy. And the one thing that I would say that I did not know going into this was, like you mentioned, Shiv, the amount of admin that comes with it. And by that, I mean, as medics, we are not used to sending emails all the time or promptly replying to things because we're on the wards and we're not expected to do that. Whereas a lot of my time was spent in meetings about teaching, or kind of emailing students or faculty and things like that. There was also a lot of timetabling stuff that you have to do.
Just unheard of words in the clinical environment.
It was really hard.
Stuff that everybody complains about so much when we're doing a clinical job.
Yeah, we always complain about when other people do it badly, but then when we have to do it ourselves.
Yeah, it's really difficult. And then you get so many emails saying like, actually, excuse me, I can't do that. And you're like, well, I can't fit you in at any other time. So it was interesting to see like how the other half live.
Yeah, it's such an important skill, to be fair, because I think we've had our fair share.
It is.
Organizing this series and launching the portfolio clinic. It's only until you experience it for yourself do you truly understand how crucial of a skill it is, actually, and something that potentially we take for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is another way, as a portfolio point, if you are in an interview and you're saying, you know, I coordinated a rota, or I've done this timetabling, I've managed XYZ number of students, that's a really good point to talk about.
Yeah.
It shows your organization, it shows your management, it shows your leadership. So that I came out of it with a lot more than I thought that I would. And that was all due to all this admin stuff. So do be aware, if that's something that you absolutely hate, bear that in mind, because it is a significant proportion of your job. The other part of it that they don't really tell you about is you do kind of quite a lot of, I don't want to say the word mentorship because it's not mentorship, but it's a lot of pastoral care for students as well as just the teaching, because you will get emails from students saying, I'm really struggling with this, or this has happened to me, or can you help me with a personal issue? And you have to know kind of obviously where your boundaries are and when to escalate with that kind of stuff. But you do a lot of that kind of that holistic approach to students. And you do have to think a lot, you know, about why students are maybe not engaging and that kind of aspect of it. So if that's something that you enjoy or you think you'd be good at, there's quite a lot of scope in those terms as well, which was really nice, actually.
It's really interesting. The two things that I didn't necessarily would play a large part of the med ed job, that sort of mentorship sort of role and sort of management role, which I think two pretty essential skills of a clinician and professional anyway, and something you're probably less likely to get in a clinical fellow role. So I think it's an excellent breadth of experience that it sounds like you gained from the last year. We've got a couple of more questions, it looks like, from the audience. So Rabi has talked about she's got basically a gap in her training. So she's started, or she's finishing F1 a bit late. So it sounds like she's got about 6 or 8 months. She wants to try and fill it with a clinical fellow role, but she's not sure how she'd go about fitting that in quite nicely. What are you guys' opinions on that?
So just from a teaching, specifically from a teaching fellow job role, those run with the academic year. So it will fit nicely if you start F1, F2 in August and finish F1, F2 in August, and then you'll do your teaching fellow job for the academic year that is September to the end of August. So, or the beginning of August, sorry. So in that way, if you don't have a full year to spare, I don't think they do any 6-month teaching fellow jobs that are associated with a medical school. Having said that, if you had 6 months, you could easily do, there are a lot of clinical jobs like A&E, for example, that will give you 1 to 2 days a week where you can dedicate to teaching medical students or starting a teaching program or some sort of education focus, or a job which allows you some more flexibility with that. So they do exist. You will have to look for them, but that's not an uncommon thing. I think A&E is the one that I've seen that most associated with, but that does exist. Apart from that, I think you could easily get a 6-month or even an as-you-go clinical job for a month that will extend. That might not necessarily need to be a full-time job. So you can kind of to have a day a week or something to spare to do other research and development kind of things. But yeah, as far as I know, the teaching fellow jobs are a full year.
Yeah, there's also opportunities in terms of clinical leadership as well, from a 6-month point of view. So the course that myself and Shiv actually did as well was a 6-month clinical leadership and education block. So there are opportunities out there for a shorter period of time. It doesn't necessarily have to be 12 months, but I fully understand that obviously from a teaching point of view, you're expected to be there for that academic year. And so, you know, to see those students through to the end of the year, you will have to start in August, which makes complete sense.
Yeah, and I think there's also, don't feel like you can't locum and do these things at the same time. The people who are really switched on will locum, and they'll make up their monthly wage within sort of 10 days, 12 days of locuming, and they can offer time to a simulation department. If you offer your time to a simulation department or a medical education centre, they will thank you heavily. So you can always get involved from that point of view as well. And you know, they're obviously getting something by having a doctor on their side running simulations or teaching sessions. You're building your portfolio, plus you're also making sort of a fairly substantial wage by locum on the side. So the great thing about the F3 year is you can do things how you want. If things don't necessarily plan in terms of, if you've got 8 months, which is a bit of an annoying block of time to have, you can do things your own way. You just have to be fairly sort of prepared to go the extra mile to organise that in advance.
Yeah, I think speaking from my own personal point of view, when we started the clinical leadership fellowship, I was very much keen to do a QI project in the clinical environment. And so I went there with the intent of doing something. And I've managed to conduct a QI project on the introduction of opt-out HIV testing in an acute trust. And gone through cycles with that, presented a grand round. These are all things that have been done, not necessarily as part of a course or a fellowship, but stuff that in your F3 year, you have that flexibility. If you're determined and you're keen and you speak to consultants and you show your enthusiasm, you'll be guided in the right direction in terms of projects and stuff that you can do on your own back as well.
Yeah, very fair point. It's about, a little bit of enthusiasm and dedication early on really does help, doesn't it?
Yeah. And good luck.
And
a bit of luck. A tiny bit of luck. Right place,
Adam,
right time.
Yeah. Adam has mentioned quite an interesting point. Look, I think we're coming slowly to the end of this session, but I think his question is really, really quite good because he's got a few months now before these applications start to go in. In your opinion, Divolka, how can he maximise that time to make his application better, to make him stand out? And what are they really going to look for? You mentioned a couple of things at interview, like in terms of enthusiasm, but what are there any other specifics that really helped you or you noticed might be useful?
I think it's important to just be aware, like they're not looking for you to have set up your own teaching program and have run it for 6 months or anything like that. Like if you have had any sort of interest or involvement for a relatively consistent period of time at medical school F1, F2, and you can talk about it in an enthusiastic way that shows what you taught the students, how it helped them, how it helped you, then I don't think you need too much more than that. Like it's not that they're looking for the person who's done the most. They are looking for people who are committed to it and enthusiastic. But having said that, at the minute, especially in surgery and things like that, we're really struggling to help medical students or F1s, F2s get into theatre, to do a bit of surgical skills, to do just pretty much anything that is practical and useful for them. So if you see any gap in medical student teaching that you could fill in the next few months, then speak to a consultant to back it, or a reg to back it, and try and set something up that doesn't have to be weekly. It could be fortnightly or monthly, whether you're doing it face-to-face or via Zoom. You just need to get enough people involved in it. And it doesn't have to be you running it all the time. A lot of it is, can you get other people involved to help you? Can you lead a team? Can you organize teaching? So if you can show that, something I would say, and again, nobody's going to ask you for proof of this at the stage of a teaching fellow role, but it would be a good idea to maybe get some feedback from the sessions that you're running, so that you can show that you understand the importance of finding out what people knew before, finding out what they know after your session, and how you're using that feedback to get better, because that's something that people is important to your practice and to other people. I think F1s, F2s, you've got Horus and you've got your clinical teacher forms on Horus. So I think if you can get a couple of those done, that shows that you've got feedback from a senior as well. And you can say at interview, listen, I've done teaching for medical students or my peers, and I've had feedback from them. I've had feedback from my consultant. This is what I learned. This is how I changed the next time and made it better. And this is what I will be committed to doing in the future. I don't think you need to have done loads and loads of stuff.
Yeah. I think is the reflection and the enthusiasm and the commitment that's key there. Actually, can you reflect on exactly what experience you've had, however big or small the experience is, and can you become a better teacher from that experience? And can you show how you can do that as well? And I think that's probably the most impressive thing for interviewers. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think that moves us quite nicely onto our final question in terms of the portfolio, which is quite important to Sergeant and I. You mentioned
close to the heart.
Yeah. In terms of like, how did you keep a portfolio for your feedback and things? Did you have a written portfolio? Did you have an online portfolio? How did you keep all of that information in one place so that you could utilize it in sort of your CST interview, for example?
Yeah, so it is difficult if you don't have access to Horus anymore and it's not like this nice structured portfolio that you can use. I just made my own feedback forms for students. So there's lots on the internet that you can kind of use for inspiration. And I kind of made them a before and after feedback form. And I got them to fill that in and either scanned it into just Word documents and kept it on my laptop. There's also loads of stuff like SurveyMonkey now, and loads of like online feedback that people can give you, anonymous feedback, and you can have access to it. And then you can make charts and diagrams and things of how they felt before and how they felt after.
All the statistics.
Give you all the stats that makes it look great.
Very pretty.
But yeah, I pretty much just, and you don't have to get feedback on every single session that you do. But for me, I had blocks of students every month, so they would change every month. So it was quite useful for me to say, well, the first month I did it like this and this was the feedback that I got, and then by the end of it, this is the feedback that I got, so this was the change. In terms of all the stuff that you do, for me, obviously for my portfolio for CST, I didn't have to do a physical portfolio, so I didn't have to make it look all pretty, which some of you will have to do in the future. But just everything that you do, every audit that you present, every bit of feedback that you get, just put it in the same folder on your laptop or your USB. Do not lose things, back it up to Dropbox, even if it's not pretty and it's a bit of a mess, just so that you've got
it's there.
So that it's there, because it's important. In terms of feedback, if you're doing a PG cert, there's a lot of focus on assessment and feedback in that. So they gave us some forms to fill out, for each other. So that was quite a good way of, I could see what the relevant things were and I could disseminate that to students. I have heard somebody say to me recently as an F3 that they managed to extend their Horus portfolio. I don't know how they did it. I don't know if it's possible. I don't know if as an F3 it's the best thing for you to use. I'm sure that there are other portfolios that you guys will know more about, I'm sure.
I actually did that, to be honest.
No, I think actually, so you can do it. You can do it. So we mentioned this in our last session, but you can, if you speak to the postgraduate department, if you're staying on as a fellow or potentially even as a locum, they might extend your Horus. So the most important thing is to have some sort of portfolio, whether it's a written or online. Online is just easier. If we've got Horus from F1 and F2, naturally it's quite easy to extend that. So yeah, definitely look at doing that beforehand.
They weren't just rumors, Divolka. It's real.
Truth. I know. I missed it. I missed the boat. But yeah, no, it's, and every conference that you go to or every course that you attend, make sure that you get a certificate, because at some point, somewhere along the way, it will be useful for you. So just make sure that you ask the relevant people to give you feedback. It's difficult to get feedback from consultants. I'm sure you guys know. I'm really struggling with core surgery now, and getting my consultants to sign stuff off online just doesn't seem to be happening. But you do, if you have to pester people, you have to pester people, and then you got to do what you got to do. So don't feel bad about emailing people several times. That's the
advice. Yeah. The best piece of advice.
Yeah. Email everybody a billion times. Yeah.
Any other questions, Sergeant, that you had before we sort of wrap up here? I think that's probably it.
I can't think of anything in particular. I think we've covered so much, so many interesting things.
Yeah, and we've run over quite a lot. I hope everyone's still out there and is around. So effectively, that probably wraps up today. Thanks everyone for attending. If you didn't catch the whole session, we'll have the session online as a catch-up service on Medals platform. While we're here, I think we do need to sort of give a nod to Medal because they're hosting for us today. They're very keen on widening access to healthcare training. Go and check out their website, which I've got here for you. Where is it? And they also, interestingly, have their own portfolio platform. So if you didn't get Horus, you can always utilize their platform for like posting like CBDs, reflections, all sorts. And they also have lots of other host lots of different organizations like ourselves who run different teaching sessions virtually. Otherwise, forms. Fill out the feedback forms, please, for us. That's thanks, Sergeant, for that reminder.
The last, note that we had from the talk, I thought, I might as well jump in there with feedback forms.
That's our feedback form. We'll also be sending it out as a reminder in the next day or so. And just finally, I wanted to share my screen and show you the portfolio clinic, which is a project that Sergeant and I have been working on. So can you see that? Can everyone see that? Mm-hmm. So effectively, it's a virtual portfolio development service for aspiring trainees. At the moment, we're going to be running CST, IMT, and anaesthetic portfolio clinics, bringing aspiring trainees to a mentor who's just got into that training sort of career pathway, and helping them to develop their portfolio, but also with a little bit of mentorship. You can register online via the Mentee link, or you can also sort of email me or Sergeant if you want to find out a little bit more information. We'll leave our emails in there. So mine is portfolio.com. That's right. So you can email me if you have any queries or questions. Divolka, I'm sure we can pass over. If you have any further questions in the future, we can share them with her, and she can we can disseminate that. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us. Is there anything else, Sergeant, that I've missed?
I don't think so.
Just finally, the link to the website if you want to check it out and register as a mentee or a mentor. That's it there. Okay, right, well, we'll see you later. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch up soon, I'm sure.
You're very welcome. I hope it was useful for everyone.
Thank you very much. Such a wonderful talk.